been a Christian very long, then you will know that being a Christian means that you are not just a Christian on Sunday morning, but that you need to let following Jesus, being a Christ follower, a Christ one, inform every day, every decision, every relationship in your life. Sometimes we're good at doing devotions and trying to pray and read our Bibles on a regular basis, but we forget that when we say that we are born again, that means that we're born not just as a child of God, but that we are children of God who have brothers and sisters. You are born again into a family of Christ the King followers. And this family that we are born into is not a family that we get to choose, but whom God chooses. And so you may be fellowshipping with brothers and sisters who are very different than you, whether they are different from you in the kind of job they do, their life situation, their background, or anything else that you think might separate you from them. But when you follow Jesus Christ, you are required not only to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, but also to love other people in your family, God's family. And this is a very difficult thing to do sometimes. I can tell you that firsthand, because I am a slave. My name, Onesimus, tells you about all you need to know about me. My name means useful. Imagine that, naming a person useful, as if they were nothing more than a thing to be used. But this is my reality, the truth about me. I am a slave. And as such, I am nothing more than this in the eyes of the law, and, if truth be told, in the eyes of anyone else who is above me in class, which is everyone else, because I am a slave, a body, a human tool, named, perhaps even by my master, as many slaves who live in this area were named. A name that's suitable, pragmatic, even if it is demeaning, reinforcing the fact that I'm not considered a person. I'm merely a thing, a tool with arms and legs. I'm a slave called Onesimus, useful. But I, even I, a slave pretty much beneath everyone else in society, became a follower of King Jesus. It all started when I fled from my master's house. His name is Philemon, and of the two of us you have probably heard of him, not me. He is the one with the status. He's the leader, the father of the family, or paterfamilias, who's the head of every person, whether wife, child, or slave, who lives in his household. I'm a slave who belongs to Philemon. I cannot do much to change that. And no matter what picture you might have in your head of the life of a slave, the ultimate truth about me is that I am wholly owned by another human being, a man who can determine my fate. A slave owner has complete control over a slave's body. They can do anything they want with it. Anything. A slave might do any kind of job that you think of, so a slave doesn't only do work that's considered demeaning, they can do any kind of work their master wants them to do. And a master can punish a slave who is lazy and who doesn't please him or her in some way. Masters can beat us, they can torture us, they can sell us, they can sell any member of our families who are also a slave, spouses, children, parents. It doesn't matter. It is only the master's will that matters. And so everything in a slave's life depends upon the master and what kind of man or woman he or she is. It is possible, I suppose, that there are masters who are kind, who do not shout at, beat, or insult their slaves. I have heard it is so. This, however, is not my experience, not even with Philemon. I've only ever known Philemon as my master, my owner, and I have heard his cruel words, and I've felt the lash of his tongue and the harsh discipline of the whip. As a slave, you don't run away from a master who is good and kind and loving all of the time. Philemon may be a good man, but he is still a slave owner, who held the lives of other human beings in his hand. who profited from their unpaid work in the household, who both went to slave markets to purchase a human being who had been stripped naked for all to examine, with a list of their characteristics and work habits hung around their necks, and bartered money for their purchase, and a man who took his own slaves at times to this same slave market, and himself treated them to this demeaning and soul-harrowing experience. And so when I had the opportunity to flee from this household, this situation, yes, even this man, I did so. I fled even though I was required to travel quite a distance, a journey that I undertook with hardly anything at all. All that I had was what I took from Philemon's house. Yes, I committed a crime. I stole from my master. I didn't see any other way out at the time. All I could think of was getting away and having enough to purchase or find what I needed in the way of food, drink, and lodging along the way. Maybe to have something of value to bribe a slave catcher if one happened to get me. If I could accomplish this great journey, once I reached the big city of Ephesus, I thought I could blend in, get work, and hide from Philemon forever. That was my plan. But God, it seems, had other plans for me. I ended up meeting the Apostle Paul, who was at that time in prison. And Paul was the first person who introduced me to King Jesus. And at first I didn't really know what to make of it, but I listened politely anyway, as I didn't want Paul to turn me in, as he was required to do with a runaway slave according to Roman law. But then, later, as he spoke, what he was saying to me began to make some sense. And finally, one day I decided to give my life over to King Jesus and let him be my Lord and my Master, and to follow his ways. But it didn't end there. I was with Paul, and Paul was important in this Christian movement. And even in prison, Paul had things he needed done. Now, certainly, I might not have been very useful to Philemon. I certainly didn't give him my best service. And the fact that I stole from him and ran away when I fell out of favor with him would make me less than useful. But in my service to my new King Jesus and to my new friend Paul, I endeavored to live up to my name and be very useful indeed. I could help Paul not only in caring for his needs while he was in bondage, but he also allowed me to share and help in his ministry with him. Paul shared the good news of Jesus Christ with me, and now I in turn could share it with others. I helped Paul in any way that I could, even preaching to other people and teaching them as Paul instructed me, and doing whatever else it was that Paul needed done. And as much as I loved my new life, so much different from the one in which I'd felt trapped, there was a problem, and that was this. I had run away from my master, Philemon. And Philemon was a Christian, one of the people who had come to know about Jesus. Philemon and Paul were friends. Both were important in the movement of the followers of Jesus. And since I had been born again, if you want to use that language, into this new family, that meant that Philemon wasn't just my owner, wasn't just the master I had run away from. He was now my brother in Christ. And Paul told me that in order to best follow King Jesus, I needed to be right in relationship with everyone that I could, so far as it was possible for me. The church in my time, as it is in yours, was thick with relationships, with people who knew and loved and depended upon and supported and uplifted, and yes, even fought with one another. Does that sound familiar to you? And yet part of being part of the body of Jesus Christ means that we work out these relationships with one another and live them to the glory of God. My situation, our situation, the place where the slave owner and his slave would both serve King Jesus, posed a real challenge, a real life situation in which we had to decide how we would live and serve King Jesus in this situation. How does a master who also loves Jesus treat his slaves? Does he have to stop beating them, threatening them, sleeping with them, working them too hard? Does he have to feed them better? Does he have to make sure they have enough clothing? Should he even own slaves? None of this was certain in my day. We were trying to work this out, trying to figure it out as we went. Our situation was, as you might say, a place where the rubber of our faith would meet the road of our real and everyday lives. No one knew all the answers, not even the Apostle Paul. Just as you are in your day, we were challenged to live out our faith in our everyday lives, whether we were masters trying to decide what to do with our slaves, or husbands deciding how to treat our wives, or wives deciding how to treat our husbands, parents deciding how to treat their children, slaves deciding how to treat their masters. And in your everyday life, you have many decisions also about how you will live out those two most important commands of King Jesus: to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. You too have to figure out how to love God and love your neighbor in whatever situation you are in. Whether you are a husband or a wife, a son or a daughter, a brother or a sister, a parent or a child, a worker or a boss, a co-worker, a friend, a neighbor, and the list goes on. It would not do, Paul said, for him to keep me, even if I was helping him spread the gospel of Jesus Christ, if it meant that Paul's relationship with Philemon was severed because Paul kept me on without Philemon's consent. And Paul didn't want to let this thing, that I was a slave who had run away from his master, to come between Philemon and me either. And so Paul said I had to go back to Philemon, to his household, and to make things right with him. I can't tell you how terrifying the thought of returning to Philemon was. As a runaway slave, a slave who had even wronged Philemon, he had the ability to punish me in any number of ways, up to and including ordering my death. In this situation, Philemon has all the power, and I have none. And it is not only my life at stake here. One of the things that I have left to answer for in my life is that, in my personal choice to run away from Philemon, I put every other slave in Philemon's household at risk of retaliation and punishment. Because when a slave ran away, it was naturally assumed that the other slaves knew that slave had planned to run, maybe even planned to steal something, and had not stopped them or reported it. So my return might have consequences for more than just me. There could be consequences for every other slave in the house. And so I was set to return to Philemon's household, but I was not to return alone. Paul wrote a letter, co-authored along with Timothy, which he gave me to carry, and which would be read in the household, concerning me and the situation between me and Philemon. Now, a letter might not seem like much of a tool of persuasion. It might not seem like it would be much of a protection against all the things that Philemon could do to me, both as his slave and as a slave who was on the run. But you should keep in mind that letters in my day were not put in security envelopes and delivered to private mailboxes, where a person could pick up the letter and read it in secret. When Paul and Timothy sent a letter, the carrier of the letter reads that letter to everyone in the entire congregation, everyone in the house. And so I carry only a letter to Philemon, yes, but I know that this letter is not going to be read by him alone. No, it will be read to the entire household church that meets at my master's estate. So not only will Philemon, my old master, hear the letter that Paul and Timothy wrote, but so will Apphia and Archippus. And not only these sisters and brothers in the Christian faith, but everyone in the household church. So not just my master and other people of high status who have enough wealth to own slaves, but also any others who meet in this house, men and women, children, young and old, neighbors and fellow believers, and even those who are inquiring, seeking out a new faith in Jesus Christ. And also, mixed among us are those who were born free, those who obtained their freedom, known as freedmen, and people who were still slaves. Everything that happens after this letter is read will depend upon the response of Philemon. But one thing that comforts me is the fact that while the decision about what to do next rests with him alone, there are a great cloud of witnesses, people who would be very interested to know what will come of me, what Philemon will do in response to what Paul has written to him, including those other slaves that I mentioned who are in the audience, the gallery, the congregation, the gathering on this day. How Philemon responds to me may, after all, affect them too. By sending me back with this public letter that was to be read to the entire church gathering, Paul refuses to let this private matter between a slave and his master stay secret and private. All eyes are on us, and whatever Philemon decides to do with me and to me will be known by every other member of the household. Not to mention, word will get back to Paul and Timothy and the other Christian leaders about what Philemon decides to do. Paul even adds a little note to Philemon to get his guest room ready so that Paul will come and check up on this situation soon. Philemon does not have the luxury of secrecy. How he lives out his Christian commitment in terms of this slave will be there for everyone to see. Was Philemon so caught up in his slave-owning ways that he refused to let his allegiance to his new king, Jesus Christ, into this part of his life? I wasn't sure, but Paul was. Paul believed that Philemon loved both Jesus and Paul himself and would listen to what Paul had to say. And this letter that I carried, I knew did not contain a command from Paul. Now, when there are troubles in churches, Paul is certainly well known for writing under his own authority as an apostle. Paul is not above giving commands to people whom he thought were behaving badly or were straying down dangerous roads in their faith. And how I wished he would have written a strongly worded letter reminding Philemon of the fact that Paul was an apostle who deserved great respect, and he deserved to be listened to, and he should be obeyed. But his letter says none of that. Instead, Paul prefers to appeal to Philemon on the basis of love. Paul in that moment behaved very much like the Jesus that he followed. Instead of making himself more important, commanding respect from Philemon, Paul makes himself less important. Paul pointed out that he's currently shackled, in bonds, imprisoned for his faith in Jesus Christ. And as a prisoner, he's certainly a whole lot closer to me, Onesimus, the slave at the bottom of the social ladder, than he is to Philemon, the paterfamilias, the king of the heap, the top of the hill, the man who, in this situation which concerned the rest of my life, held every scrap of power. And Paul let him keep that power, and instead appeals to Philemon as a friend, a fellow laborer for King Jesus, a partner in the gospel, on the basis of love. Paul calls himself an old man, a prisoner of Jesus Christ. Instead of puffing himself up in order to get Philemon to listen to him, Paul instead empties himself and identifies more with me, the slave, than he does with the man with all the power. And as the letters goes on, Paul does more than simply put himself next to this slave. He goes on to tell Philemon that however he treats me, he will be treating Paul himself. When Philemon sees me as his runaway slave, he is to see his friend and giant in the Christian movement, the Apostle Paul. And however Philemon chooses to respond to me, for Paul makes it very clear that it is, after all, Philemon's choice, he will be responding in kind to Paul. When Philemon looks at me, he's supposed to see Paul. Paul is asking Philemon to receive me, his slave, not surely as I deserved, if not according to human dignity, then at least under the law of the land at that time, but instead to receive me as a brother in Jesus Christ. Now Philemon could have ignored Paul's request and punished me with every means he liked under the law. That option was open to him. He could also have admitted me back into his household as a slave much as before. So much would not have changed. He could also have granted me my freedom, so I would become what was known as a freedman, who was probably still much in debt to the paterfamilias. Or he could have granted me my freedom outright. Or he could have kept me as a slave, but commissioned me to serve Paul and the gospel of Jesus Christ, and all of these things are within his rights. But above all, what Paul wanted was for Philemon to welcome me into his fellowship as better than a slave, as if I were Philemon's own brother. As if the fact that he is a slave owner and I am a slave, that he is at the top of society and I am at the bottom, as if all that didn't matter as long as we're within the walls of the church, because we're both servants and lovers of King Jesus. He wants the rules of society, which separated those with status and wealth and power from those with none, to be completely changed in this new movement, which is called the Church of Jesus Christ. Paul wanted that instead of relating to each other as master and slave, we would relate to each other as brothers. Paul wanted people who were on the fringe, the outside of the society, to be invited as brothers and sisters, and to be allowed to sit and eat together at the table of those whom we formerly served. In short, Paul wants the community of Jesus Christ to look different than the rest of the world. In the walls of the church, we should see one another not in the way that the world divides things, rich and poor, man and woman, slave and free, Jewish and Gentile. Instead, all of those things that usually divide us should no longer matter, because we are to live with one another in love and fellowship and service to Jesus, who is our only King and Master. And I tell you, this was a hard step to take. I was terrified. My heart was pounding 800 times a minute as I stood there listening to this letter being read about me, looking in Philemon's eyes the whole time. But I believed Paul when he said that I too had to act as a brother and not as a slave toward Philemon. I had to do everything I could to make this relationship right between us. And how did this all turn out? The truth is, no one knows. All we can say for sure is this: the letter to Philemon is still in your Bibles today. And so the greatest likelihood is that Philemon, out of love for Jesus Christ and for Paul, did accept me into his house as more than a slave, but as his beloved brother. It is unlikely that this letter would have survived if indeed Philemon had burned it up upon reading it in his household and cast out anyone associated with me or with Paul. And history has given us this little tidbit, which I leave for your own imaginations. In the 1st century, there was a bishop in Ephesus by the name of Onesimus. Now, my name is not so uncommon as to assume that this really is me. Here is what one Ignatius writes: "Since, therefore, I have received in God's name your whole congregation in the person of Onesimus, a man of inexpressible love, who is also your earthly bishop, I pray that you will love him in accordance with the standard set by Jesus Christ, and that all of you will be like him. For blessed is the one who has graciously allowed you, worthy as you are, to have such a bishop." So maybe, just maybe, a useless, runaway slave such as myself was reconciled to my master, restored to Paul, and became a person of some importance in the early church. Who knows? stranger things have happened in the kingdom of God, in the fellowship of the church of King Jesus Christ.